When we think of the Middle Ages, we often imagine a world of castles and knights, of merchants and markets, of kings and battles. But behind these images, there was another side to medieval life. The quiet, daily reality of ordinary people. And among those people, half of the population lived under rules and expectations that made them far less valued than others. These were the women of the Middle Ages. In the medieval world, a woman's worth was not measured in the same way as a man's. In many places, she was not seen as a person with equal rights, choices, or opportunities. Instead, she was often valued for what she could provide to her family, her husband, or her community. And that value was usually tied to her role as a daughter, a wife, and a mother. Outside of these roles, her importance in society was often overlooked or dismissed. This was not because medieval women were without skill, strength, or intelligence. In truth, women worked as hard as men, and sometimes harder. They ran households, tended animals, grew and prepared food, cared for children, spun and wove cloth, brewed ale, and even helped with farming during busy seasons. In towns, they kept shops, worked as servants, and sold goods in the marketplace. And yet, despite all of this labor, their contribution was rarely seen as equal. The laws and customs of the time reflected this imbalance. In many regions of medieval Europe, women could not own property in their own name once they were married. Their legal identity became tied to their husbands. In the eyes of the law, a married woman was under the protection and the control of her husband. Even unmarried women often needed a male relative to speak for them in legal matters. The church, which shaped much of medieval thought and culture, also reinforced these ideas. Religious teachings often described women as weaker, more easily tempted, and in need of guidance from men. The story of Eve from the Bible was frequently used as a warning, a reminder that women were seen as the ones who had brought sin into the world. These beliefs influenced how women were treated in daily life, in marriage, and in the workplace. Education was another area where women were undervalued. While boys from wealthy families might be sent to learn reading, writing, and Latin, girls were often taught only the skills needed to manage a home. Some girls from noble families did receive an education, especially if they were sent to a convent. But for most, learning was practical, not academic. Literacy rates for women were far lower than for men, which made it harder for them to take part in public life or to leave behind a record of their own thoughts and achievements. Marriage in the Middle Ages was less about romance and more about alliances, property, and survival. A young woman's marriage was often arranged by her parents. Her opinion might be asked, but it did not always decide the outcome. In many cases, she had little say in whom she married or when. Once married, she was expected to obey her husband, manage his household, and bear his children. Her ability to produce heirs was considered one of her most important qualities. Even in work, women were undervalued. Many women worked alongside men in trades such as brewing, weaving, or market selling. But their labor was often paid less, credited to their husbands, or simply seen as part of their household duties rather than as independent work. A widow might be able to take over her husband's business, but even then, her authority was often questioned. It is important to remember that not all women's lives were the same. A noble woman's daily life was different from that of a peasant woman. A nun's life in a convent was different from that of a merchant's wife in a busy town. But across all these roles, the same idea was present: that women were not considered as important or as valuable as men. This did not mean that women were powerless. Many found ways to influence their families, their communities, and even politics. Some became respected landowners, skilled artisans, or abbesses who ran large and wealthy convents. But these were exceptions, not the rule. For most women, the path of life was narrow, and their value in society was measured in limited ways. In this story, we will walk slowly through the many parts of a medieval woman's life. We will see her place in the home, in marriage, in work, and in the laws of her time. We will see how religion shaped her role, how education was limited to her, and how even her body was often treated as belonging to someone else. We will see how her worth was measured, and how often that worth was underestimated. And as we move through this journey, we will remember that the idea of women as less valuable than men was not born from their lack of ability, but from the rules, beliefs, and structures of their time. It was a world that measured people differently than we do today. And in that measurement, women were given less weight. By the end of our journey, you will understand why medieval women were so often considered unvaluable in the eyes of their society, even though their labor, their care, and their strength were essential to the survival of that very same society. To understand why medieval women were considered less valuable in their society, we must begin at the very start of their lives, in childhood. From the moment a girl was born in the Middle Ages, her life was shaped by ideas about what it meant to be female. These ideas determined how she was treated, what was expected of her, and what opportunities she would and would not be given. The birth of a child was always a significant event in a family. In the Middle Ages, every new life was precious, but the reaction to a baby's arrival often depended on whether it was a boy or a girl. A son was usually greeted with great celebration. He represented the continuation of the family name, the heir who might inherit property, carry on the family trade, and provide protection for his relatives. A daughter, while welcomed with love by many families, was less often seen as a long-term investment. In some households, the news of a girl's birth might be met with quiet acceptance rather than open joy. This difference in attitude was not because girls were unwanted as children, but because their value in society was tied to what they could bring to their family in the future. A boy could one day work for wages, join a guild, inherit land, or take on a position in the church. A girl's future was usually tied to marriage, and her worth was often linked to the dowry her family could provide, and the alliance her marriage could secure. From infancy, girls were often cared for by their mothers, grandmothers, or other female relatives. Boys might spend more time with their fathers once they were old enough to walk and talk, learning the skills of their father's trade or work. Girls, by contrast, were taught from a very young age to help in the home. They might begin by playing with scraps of fabric or pretending to care for dolls, but these games quickly turned into real tasks. By the age of 5 or 6, many girls were expected to help with simple chores, fetching water, sweeping floors, or helping to care for younger siblings. Education for girls in most medieval communities was not academic. In wealthier households, some girls might learn to read, write, or do basic arithmetic, but this was not common for the majority. Education meant learning practical skills that would prepare them for their roles as wives, mothers, and keepers of the household. They learned to cook, to sew and mend clothing, to spin wool into thread, and to weave that thread into cloth. They learned how to tend a garden, care for chickens, and preserve food for the winter. These were valuable skills, but they were not valued in the same way as the skills taught to boys. The way girls were spoken to also shaped their understanding of themselves. From a young age, they were reminded to be modest, to obey, and to serve others. A good daughter was quiet, respectful, and hardworking. Girls were praised for their ability to follow instructions and for their willingness to put others' needs before their own, while boys might be encouraged to explore, question, and take risks. Girls were more often taught to accept, endure, and remain within the boundaries set for them. In noble families, the upbringing of daughters was different in some ways, but similar in its underlying message. A noble girl might be taught music, dancing, embroidery, and perhaps a little reading or writing in preparation for life at court. She might be sent to live in another noble household as part of her education, learning how to manage servants, host guests, and keep accounts. But all of this training was still aimed at making her a suitable wife for a future husband. Her accomplishments were meant to make her more attractive in the marriage market, not to give her independence. Even play reflected the roles expected of girls. In villages, girls played games that often imitated adult life, making pretend meals, sewing small pieces of cloth, or caring for imaginary babies. In noble households, play might involve practicing courtly manners or learning to perform in small household entertainments. These activities were enjoyable, but they also reinforced the idea that a girl's main purpose was to serve, to care, and to please. In some cases, girls were sent into service in other households while still young. This was especially common in towns and cities. A girl of 12 or 13 might leave her family to work as a servant in a wealthier home. There, she would learn new skills, but she would also work long hours for little pay, always under the authority of her employers. This early service prepared her for marriage by teaching her obedience, patience, and the ability to manage household tasks. But it also reinforced her position as someone who served rather than someone who led. Religion played a major role in the upbringing of medieval girls. The teachings of the church emphasized humility, obedience, and purity. Stories from the Bible were used to illustrate the virtues expected of women and the dangers of failing to uphold them. The example of the Virgin Mary was held up as the ideal: gentle, obedient, faithful, and pure. Girls grew up knowing that their reputation depended not only on their work and conduct, but also on their perceived moral character. From the earliest years, medieval girls were taught to think of themselves in relation to others as daughters, sisters, wives, and mothers. They were not encouraged to see themselves as individuals with their own goals and ambitions. Their value was tied to how well they could fulfill the roles set out for them by family, society, and the church. And because these roles were considered less important than the roles assigned to men, girls learned early that they were less valued in the eyes of the world. This early shaping of identity was powerful. A girl who grew up being told her worth lay in her obedience, her service, and her modesty was far more likely to accept the limitations placed upon her as an adult. The seeds of undervaluation were planted in childhood, and they grew into the attitudes and customs that governed a woman's life in the Middle Ages. By understanding the upbringing of medieval girls, we can see how deeply rooted the idea of women as less valuable truly was. It began at birth, was reinforced every day of childhood, and followed them into adulthood, shaping not only their own sense of self, but also how others saw them for the rest of their lives. For a medieval woman, marriage was not just a stage of life. It was often the central purpose for which her upbringing and education had prepared her. From her earliest years, a girl was shaped for the role of wife and mother. Whether she was the daughter of a peasant farmer, a town merchant, or a noble lord, society's expectations for her future were clear. She would marry, she would bear children, and she would serve her husband and his household. Marriage in the Middle Ages was rarely about romance in the way we think of it today. It was a practical arrangement, a union that served the interests of families, not just the desires of individuals. Among peasants, marriage was often timed to coincide with the ability to support a household. Among the wealthy, marriage was a strategic alliance designed to strengthen family ties, gain land, or increase wealth. Love could grow within a marriage, but it was rarely the reason for it. For daughters of noble families, marriage was often arranged years before it actually took place. Negotiations between families could begin while the girl was still a child. The discussion centered around property, dowry, and alliances, not her personal wishes. A noblewoman's hand in marriage could seal a peace agreement, unite rival families, or expand influence over a region. Her marriage was a tool of politics and strategy, and she was expected to accept it without protest. In merchant families, marriage could serve similar purposes. A father might arrange for his daughter to marry a man whose trade connections would benefit the family business. In farming communities, marriage could join two small plots of land into one, improving the family's ability to survive. Even in these more modest circumstances, the match was chosen with practical benefit in mind. The dowry was an important part of this process. It was the money, goods, or property that a bride's family gave to the groom or his family as part of the marriage agreement. The size and value of the dowry could influence the quality of the match a girl could secure. Wealthier families could offer larger dowries, which might lead to better matches. Poorer families sometimes struggled to marry off daughters if they could not provide enough. In some sad cases, daughters with no dowry were sent to convents because marriage was not an option. Once married, a woman's life changed in profound ways. Legally, in many places, her identity became tied to her husband's. She could not own property in her own name, sign contracts, or conduct business independently without his approval. In the eyes of the law, her husband was her guardian. This meant that even her earnings from work often belonged to him. While this legal dependence varied from place to place, the general idea was widespread. A married woman was under her husband's authority. In the home, she was expected to manage the household, a task that involved far more than cleaning or cooking. She oversaw the preparation and storage of food, managed servants if the family could afford them, cared for children, maintained clothing and linens, and often took part in agricultural work or the family trade. A wife was a partner in keeping the household running, but her contributions were rarely recognized as equal to those of her husband. Motherhood was seen as her most important role. The ability to bear children was considered central to a woman's value as a wife. Producing heirs was vital in noble families, where property and titles needed to be passed down. In all social classes, having children was essential for the survival of the family. Children could help with work, continue the family trade, and care for parents in old age. A woman who could not have children was sometimes seen as less valuable, and this could affect her position in the household and her marriage. Childbearing in the Middle Ages was dangerous. Without modern medical care, many women died in childbirth or from complications afterward. But the risks did not change society's expectations. Women were still expected to bear as many children as possible, often for most of their married life. The cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and nursing defined much of a woman's adult years. Marriage also came with clear expectations for behavior. A good wife was loyal, obedient, and hardworking. She was expected to respect her husband's authority, follow his decisions, and avoid bringing shame to his name. Infidelity by a wife was seen as a serious offense, sometimes punished harshly. Infidelity by a husband, while disapproved of, was often treated less severely. In noble households, a wife might also be expected to represent her husband in his absence, managing estates and making decisions about household affairs. This could give her a degree of influence, but it did not mean she was seen as equal. Her authority came from her position as his wife, not from her own independent status. In peasant families, husband and wife often worked side by side in the fields, tending crops, caring for animals, and managing daily survival. But even in this shared labor, the man was considered the head of the household. His word carried more weight in decisions, and his work was often valued more highly, even if the wife's efforts were just as essential. Religion reinforced these expectations. The church taught that marriage was a sacred union, with the husband as the head and the wife as his helper. Biblical passages were often interpreted to mean that a woman should submit to her husband's authority. These teachings shaped not only personal relationships, but also the laws and customs that governed marriage. For many medieval women, marriage was both security and limitation. It provided a place in society, protection, and a household to belong to. But it also bound them to a role that left little room for personal ambition or independence. A married woman's worth was measured by her ability to serve her husband, manage his household, and bear his children. Outside of these roles, her value was rarely recognized. Even widows, who sometimes had more freedom than married women, were still expected to remarry or to live quietly under the care of male relatives. Only in certain cases, such as wealthy widows who inherited property, could a woman act with true independence. But even then, her position was unusual and often regarded with suspicion. Marriage and family expectations in the Middle Ages were deeply woven into the fabric of society. They shaped not only the lives of women, but also the way women were valued or undervalued. From the moment a girl was old enough to understand her place in the world, she knew that marriage was her destiny, and that her worth would be judged by how well she fulfilled the roles of wife and mother. In the Middle Ages, work was not just a necessity, it was a constant part of life. Survival depended on it. Fields had to be tended, goods had to be made, food had to be prepared, and trade had to be maintained. And women were deeply involved in all of this labor. They worked every day, often from dawn until well after dark. Yet, despite their tireless contributions, the work of women was often undervalued, overlooked, or simply taken for granted. For most medieval women, work began in the home. The home was not just a place to live. It was a place of production. Women spun wool into yarn, wove that yarn into cloth, and sewed clothing for their families. They made candles, brewed ale, baked bread, and churned butter. They tended vegetable gardens, cared for chickens, collected eggs, and preserved food for the winter months. Every one of these tasks was essential to the survival of the household. Without them, the family could not function. Yet, much of this work was seen as part of a woman's natural duty rather than as economic labor worthy of recognition. In farming families, women's work extended far beyond the household walls. During planting and harvest seasons, women joined men in the fields. They sowed seeds, weeded crops, and gathered the harvest. They helped with threshing grain, separating the valuable kernels from the stalks. They collected hay for animals, milked cows, and cared for sheep and goats. On smaller farms, where every pair of hands mattered, women worked side by side with their husbands and sons in nearly every task. Still, their contribution was often described as helping rather than as equal labor. In towns and cities, many women worked in trades. Some were shopkeepers, selling bread, cloth, pottery, or other goods. Others worked as bakers, brewers, midwives, or laundresses. Many were employed as servants in wealthier households, doing everything from cooking and cleaning to caring for children. Servants worked long hours for modest pay, and their work, while essential, rarely earned them public respect. In some trades, women were part of family businesses. A merchant's wife might help keep accounts, sell goods in the shop, or manage trade when her husband was away. A blacksmith's wife might help with small tasks in the workshop, or a carpenter's wife might assist in preparing wood or managing orders. Yet the law and custom often credited the business entirely to the husband. A woman's role in the enterprise was seen as secondary, even when her work was vital to its success. Guilds, the professional organizations that regulated trades in medieval towns, were often closed to women. In some cases, widows could take over their late husband's guild membership and continue running the business. This allowed certain women to gain a measure of independence. But even then, they often faced skepticism from male colleagues, and pressure to remarry so that the business could return to male control. Some women worked independently, but their opportunities were limited. They might sell goods in the marketplace, take in laundry, or work as healers using herbal remedies. In larger cities, some women worked as scribes, embroiderers, or artists, though these were rare exceptions. Without the backing of a family business or guild membership, it was difficult for a woman to establish herself in a respected trade. Economic necessity sometimes pushed women into difficult or dangerous work. In some towns, women earned money by carrying heavy loads for others, cleaning streets, or working in industries like tanning, which involved unpleasant and unhealthy conditions. Others worked in taverns or inns, where the line between respectable work and disreputable activity could be thin. For the poorest women, options were even fewer, and survival could depend on forms of labor that society looked down upon. Despite all of this hard work, the economic value of women's labor was consistently underestimated. Men's work was often paid, recorded, and recognized. Women's work, especially within the home, was considered an extension of their expected duties. It was rarely assigned a monetary value, even when it contributed directly to the household's income or saved the family from having to buy goods or services. The church, too, reinforced the idea that a woman's primary role was within the home. Religious teachings praised women who were diligent housekeepers, obedient wives, and devoted mothers. While the church did value charitable works done by women, such as caring for the sick or feeding the poor, it still framed these actions as part of a woman, as natural calling rather than as contributions worthy of equal recognition alongside men as work. In wealthier households, noble women also worked, though their labor looked different. A noble woman managed estates, oversaw servants, organized household accounts, and ensured that supplies were stocked. She might arrange provisions for feasts, manage the storage of grain and wine, and make decisions about repairs to buildings. When her husband was away on military or political duties, she might act in his stead, resolving disputes among tenants or negotiating with other landowners. This was real management work, yet it was often described as keeping the home rather than as governance. Even in convents where women could live independently of male authority, work was central to daily life. Nuns engaged in teaching, caring for the sick, producing manuscripts, and growing food for their communities. These activities sustained their convents and sometimes generated income. But outside the convent walls, such work was often dismissed as the quiet duties of religious women, not recognized as professional or economic contributions. In the countryside, town, and noble court alike, the pattern was the same. Women worked hard, contributed greatly, and yet were seen as less economically valuable than men. This undervaluation was not just a matter of perception. It had real consequences. It meant that women had less say in how money was spent, fewer opportunities to own property, and less ability to shape the economic future of their families. The irony was that without women's work, medieval society could not have functioned. They were the backbone of the household economy, the essential labor in many industries, and the steady force behind the survival of families and communities. Yet because their work was often unpaid, unseen, or unacknowledged, women were left out of the measures by which society judged value. This pattern of working constantly while being undervalued was one of the strongest forces shaping women's status in the Middle Ages. It reinforced the belief that women were secondary, that their work was merely supportive, and that their place was always in relation to men. And it is one of the reasons why, in the eyes of medieval society, women were considered less valuable. In the Middle Ages, knowledge was power, and education was one of the most powerful tools a person could have. It could open doors to better work, greater influence, and a louder voice in society. But for women in medieval Europe, education was something that most would never truly receive. The opportunities to learn were limited, and even when a girl could read or write, her learning was often considered less important than that of a boy. This lack of education was one of the strongest reasons why medieval women were undervalued, because without knowledge, it was far harder to challenge the roles that society placed upon them. For most girls, education began and ended at home. In peasant families, the lessons a girl learned were almost entirely practical. She learned to cook over an open hearth, to keep the fire burning through the night, to tend the small family garden, and to care for younger siblings. She learned how to wash clothes by hand, how to mend worn garments, and how to preserve food for the winter. These were all important skills, and mastering them took time. But they were not the kind of skills that gave her a voice in the public world beyond her home. In contrast, boys, even boys from farming families, might be taught the basics of trade, business, or farming management. They learned how to measure fields, how to handle tools, and how to take part in decisions about planting and selling crops. These were skills that could lead to independence, to leadership, and to authority. Girls rarely received the same training, even when they worked just as hard in the fields. In towns and cities, some girls were given a slightly different education. Daughters of merchants or craftsmen might be taught to help with the family business. They could learn how to keep household accounts, read market tallies, and even write simple records. But even here, the knowledge was meant to help the family, not to prepare the girl for an independent life. Her role was still understood as supporting a father a husband, or a brother. Formal schooling was almost entirely reserved for boys. In many towns, small schools run by the church taught boys to read and write Latin, the language of education, government, and the church. Latin was essential for anyone who wanted to enter the clergy, study law, or take part in higher learning. Girls were rarely admitted to these schools. If they learned to read, it was usually in the language they spoke at home, and often without formal instruction. There were exceptions. Some noble families valued education for their daughters, especially if the girl might one day manage estates or serve in a noble household. These girls could be taught to read and write, to understand music, to learn French or Latin, and to practice the refined skills of embroidery, dancing, and court etiquette. But even here, the education was often as much about making her marriageable as about making her capable. For many girls, the best chance of receiving a formal education came from joining a convent. Nuns often taught reading, writing, and religious study to young girls who were being prepared for life in the church. Convents could be places of learning, especially for noble women who could afford to dedicate themselves to religious life. Within their walls, women could read, write, illuminate manuscripts, and correspond with other educated members of the church. Some convents became small centers of scholarship for women. But most women never entered a convent. For them, learning was passed down from mothers to daughters, from older sisters to younger ones, in the form of domestic skills and moral lessons. They learned how to behave, how to work, and how to maintain their reputation. They were told what was proper and what was improper, what was expected of them and what was forbidden. And while this was its own form of education, it was one that kept them firmly within the roles assigned to them. The church's attitude toward women and learning was complex. On one hand, women were encouraged to learn religious teachings so they could live moral lives. On the other hand, too much knowledge for women was often viewed with suspicion. There were fears that educated women might overstep their place, speak too boldly, or be tempted to challenge established authority. Stories of biblical figures like Eve were used to warn against the dangers of female curiosity. This fear of women gaining too much education was reflected in laws and customs. Women were often excluded from universities, which were emerging as centers of advanced study in medieval Europe. Without access to these institutions, women could not become doctors, lawyers, or scholars in the recognized sense. The professions that required such qualifications were close to them. Even when a woman had the ability and the desire to learn, the gates of higher education were rarely open. The result of this limited education was a cycle that was hard to break. Without formal learning, women had fewer chances to earn their own living, fewer opportunities to speak in public matters, and fewer ways to leave a written record of their lives. Because they left behind fewer books, letters, or legal documents, their voices were quieter in the historical record, not because they had nothing to say, but because they were rarely given the tools to say it in ways that survived. This undervaluing of women's education also had a lasting impact on how they were perceived. A woman who could not read or write might be seen as less capable, even though her lack of literacy was the result of exclusion, not of ability. At the same time, the practical skills she did have, the ability to run a household, to manage resources, to keep a family fed and clothed, were undervalued precisely because they were expected of her. It was a cruel double standard. The work she could do was considered unimportant, and the work considered important was kept out of her reach. There were rare and remarkable women who broke through these barriers. Some became writers, poets, or philosophers despite the odds. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen, Christine de Pizan, and Julian of Norwich are remembered today because they left behind writings that challenged the limits placed on women. But for every woman whose name we know, there were countless others whose talents and intelligence were never recognized because they were denied the education that could have brought them to light. By limiting women's access to learning, medieval society kept them in a position where they were dependent on men for legal, financial, and intellectual authority. This dependence reinforced the idea that women were less valuable, less able to lead, less suited to make decisions, less capable of shaping the wider world. In truth, the lack of education was not proof of their lesser worth. It was the cause of it in the eyes of their society. Education could have been a path to greater value and independence for women in the Middle Ages. But by keeping that path narrow and often closed, medieval society ensured that women's roles remained secondary. And so, the undervaluing of women was passed from one generation to the next, written not only into the laws and customs of the time, but into the very way girls were taught, or not taught from the start of their lives. The value society places on a person is often reflected in the law. In the Middle Ages, the laws of most European regions clearly showed how women were seen in relation to men. The legal codes, customs, and traditions of the time often placed women in a position of dependence. With fewer rights, less control over their own lives, and limited access to property or legal protection. These restrictions were not hidden. They were written into the rules that shaped everyday life. From the moment a woman was born, her legal status was tied to the men in her family. As a child, she was under the authority of her father or another male guardian. When she married, that authority passed to her husband. In many places, a woman could not make major legal decisions without the approval of her guardian. She could not sign contracts appear in court alone or own property independently once she was married. In the eyes of the law, her husband represented her. This system was known in some legal traditions as coverture. Under coverture, a married woman's legal identity was essentially merged with that of her husband. She could not own land in her own right unless it was specifically protected for her in a marriage contract. She could not take out a loan, sell property, or engage in certain types of business without her husband's consent. Her earnings, if she worked, were often considered her husband's property. The idea was that the husband was the head of the household and responsible for its legal and financial matters. But the result was that women's independence was severely limited. Unmarried women had more rights on paper, especially if they were widows or came from wealthy families. A widow could sometimes inherit her husband's property and manage it herself. She might run a business, oversee farmland, or control her own wealth. But even then, she often faced pressure to remarry so that a man could take over those responsibilities. In many towns, guilds or local councils preferred dealing with men rather than women, making it harder for a widow to keep her independence for long. Daughters did not inherit equally with sons in most medieval legal systems. In some places, daughters could inherit land only if there were no sons. In others, they received a portion of the estate, but much less than their brothers. This meant that property and wealth stayed primarily in male hands, reinforcing the idea that men were the rightful owners and managers of family resources. Dowries played a large role in women's property rights. When a woman married, her family gave a dowry to her husband or his family. This could include money, land, goods, or livestock. In theory, the dowry was meant to support the wife and her children. In practice, it often became part of the husband's property. If the husband died, the widow might have a legal right to reclaim her dowry. But, in reality, it could be difficult to enforce that right, especially if her husband's family resisted. Some legal codes did include protections for women. For example, many towns had laws stating that a widow could not be forced out of her home immediately after her husband's death. Some regions protected a wife's right to a small portion of her husband's estate, known as a dower, to support her in widowhood. But these protections were minimal compared to the full ownership and control men enjoyed. Women also faced legal disadvantages in court. Their testimony was often considered less reliable than a man's, especially in serious matters. In some cases, a woman's word had to be supported by male witnesses to be accepted. This was particularly damaging in situations where women were victims of crime. Accusations of theft, assault, or worse, could be dismissed if a woman could not produce male witnesses to support her claim. The church's influence on law also played a role. Canon law, The law of the church governed marriage, morality, and family matters. It reinforced the idea that the husband was the head of the household and the wife was expected to obey him. Church courts could rule on disputes involving marriage contracts, dowries, and moral conduct, while church law sometimes provided women with avenues to seek justice. For example, if a husband abandoned his wife, it still treated women as subordinate to men. Local customs could be just as restrictive as formal law. In rural villages, traditions often dictated that land and valuable goods were passed down through the male line. Even if no written law said so, the practice was deeply ingrained. A woman might work the same land her entire life without ever having her name on a deed or legal record. Her labor was essential, but her ownership was invisible. There were exceptions to these patterns, but they were rare. Some women, especially wealthy widows or noblewomen, exercised significant control over property and legal matters. In a few cases, queens, regents, and noble ladies ruled estates or even entire kingdoms. But these women were the exception. The limited legal rights of women had a powerful effect on how they were valued. If the law treated women as dependents, unable to act fully in their own name, then society would see them as less capable and less important. The inability to own property outright meant that women were rarely recognized as independent economic actors. The restrictions on their testimony meant that their voices carried less weight in public matters, and the rules around inheritance kept wealth concentrated in male hands. All of this reinforced the same message. Women were not considered equal under the law, and therefore they were not considered equal in value. Even when a woman was intelligent, skilled, and capable, the law placed her in a position of dependence that was hard to escape. It is important to remember that these laws and customs were not just about personal relationships. They were part of the structure of society. They shaped how families were organized, how wealth was passed down, and how communities functioned. By limiting women's rights, medieval law ensured that men remained the primary holders of power, property, and authority. And so, the legal system itself was one of the strongest forces in making women less valued in the Middle Ages. It did not matter how much a woman worked, how much she contributed, or how wise her decisions were. If the law treated her as someone who could not stand alone, then society would see her as someone who was less powerful, less important, and less valuable. In the Middle Ages, religion was not just a part of life, it was life itself. The church shaped how people understood the world, how they understood right and wrong, and even how they understood themselves. It provided spiritual guidance, moral teaching, and the laws that governed marriage, morality, and family. For medieval women, the church was both a source of comfort and a source of limitation. It offered a path to spiritual purpose, but it also reinforced ideas that kept women in a position of lesser value. The teachings of the church deeply influenced how women were seen. From the pulpit, in books, and in everyday conversations, the story of Eve in the Garden of Eden was often repeated. According to the biblical account, Eve was tempted by the serpent, ate the forbidden fruit, and then persuaded Adam to do the same. In medieval interpretation, this story was often used as proof that women were weaker, more easily led into temptation, and more likely to lead others into sin. This idea became part of the cultural foundation for believing that women needed guidance and control from men. Church writings and sermons described women as the weaker vessel, needing protection, instruction, and moral oversight. Many religious thinkers of the time, from St. Augustine to Thomas Aquinas, reinforced the idea that women's natural role was to serve men. They saw the hierarchy of husband over wife as part of the natural order ordained by God. To challenge this order was to challenge the structure of creation itself. Marriage, in the eyes of the church, was a sacred union, but it was also one in which the husband was the head and the wife was the helper. Wives were instructed to obey their husbands, to be modest and chaste, and to dedicate themselves to the care of the household. Husbands, in turn, were told to love and protect their wives. But the structure was always one of authority on one side and obedience on the other. The church did not see this as unfair. It saw it as divinely designed. The church also shaped women's lives through its rules on morality. Women were held to strict standards of sexual behavior, and their worth was often tied to their reputation for chastity and modesty. A woman who was accused, even unjustly, of being unchaste could lose her marriage prospects, her social standing, and her respect in the community. Men were also expected to be faithful, but the consequences for their failings were often less severe. This double standard reflected the deeper idea that a woman's primary value was in her moral purity and her ability to bear legitimate children. Opportunities for women within the church existed, but they were limited. A woman could become a nun and live in a convent, dedicating her life to prayer, service, and sometimes education. Within the convent, women could rise to positions of leadership, such as abbess, and manage large estates or religious communities. Some abbesses were powerful figures, respected by both church and secular leaders. But these were exceptions, and their authority was confined to the religious sphere. Outside the convent walls, the same societal limits applied. For most women, their interaction with the church came through attending Mass, receiving sacraments, and following church teachings in their daily lives. Priests, who were always male, were their spiritual guides and confessors. Religious instruction for women focused heavily on obedience, humility, and service. Women were encouraged to emulate the Virgin Mary, pure, gentle, obedient, and devoted. This ideal was meant to inspire, but it also set a standard that left little room for individuality or ambition. The Church's control extended into legal matters as well. Canon law governed marriage, inheritance disputes involving dowries, and questions of legitimacy. If a woman sought to annul a marriage or recover a dowry, she had to do so in a church court. While church law sometimes protected women from abuse or abandonment, it still operated within the framework that women were under male authority. A woman who challenged her husband in court risked social disapproval and the loss of her livelihood. Religious festivals and holy days also reflected women's roles. Women were often involved in preparing for celebrations, making decorations, or cooking for feasts. They took part in processions, carried offerings to the altar, and joined in prayers for the well-being of their families. These roles were valued within the community, but they were still rooted in service and support, not in leadership or decision-making. The idea that women were spiritually equal to men, souls equally capable of salvation, coexisted with the belief that they were socially and intellectually inferior. This contradiction was rarely questioned in the Middle Ages. It was accepted that in the eyes of God, men and women were of equal worth. But in the structure of earthly life, women were to be guided by men. The influence of the Church on women's place in society was profound and long-lasting. It shaped laws, reinforced customs, and gave religious authority to the belief that women were less suited to leadership, independence, or public life. By making these ideas part of the spiritual and moral fabric of society, the Church helped ensure that they would endure for centuries. And yet, it is also true that for some women, the Church was a source of opportunity. In the convent, they could escape the dangers of childbirth, avoid unwanted marriage, and devote themselves to learning and service. Some became respected writers, mystics, and advisors to powerful men. But these were rare paths, and they did not change the overall reality. For most women, the Church's influence reinforced their secondary status. In the end, the Church's role in undervaluing women was both subtle and direct. It taught that women were spiritually important but socially subordinate. It shaped laws and customs to match this belief. And it gave these ideas the weight of divine will, making them harder to challenge. In medieval Europe, to question the Church was to risk one's soul. And so, the belief in women's lesser value remained a cornerstone of society. Life in the Middle Ages was hard for everyone, but for women, it carried unique dangers that went beyond the daily struggle for survival. Violence, both within the home and outside it, was a constant threat. And while the medieval world had rules, customs, and even laws meant to offer protection, These protections were often weak, poorly enforced, or simply ignored. When the victim was a woman, this vulnerability did more than put women in danger. It reinforced the idea that they were less valued, less protected, and less important than men. The dangers began close to home. In medieval society, the home was considered the man's domain, and he was expected to maintain order within it. Unfortunately, this belief could be used to justify control through force. Physical punishment of wives by their husbands was widely accepted, both legally and socially. In some places, laws even stated that a man could discipline his wife as long as it did not cause permanent injury. The idea that a wife might be beaten for her own good was part of the cultural understanding of marriage. A woman who suffered violence at the hands of her husband often had little recourse. Divorce, in the modern sense, did not exist for most people. The church allowed separation in cases of extreme cruelty or abandonment, but this was rare and difficult to achieve. Even if a separation was granted, the woman might lose her home, her children, and her means of support. Many endured abuse in silence because the cost of leaving was too high. Outside the home, the risks were just as serious. Roads between towns could be unsafe, with the threat of bandits, thieves, or worse. In villages and cities, women walking without male company could be harassed or assaulted. The danger was greater for poorer women who had to work outside the home or travel for employment. Servant girls, washerwomen, and market sellers were particularly vulnerable to harassment by customers, employers, or strangers. The legal system often failed women in these situations. In cases of sexual assault, the victim's testimony might not be taken seriously unless supported by male witnesses, a nearly impossible requirement in most cases. Even when a woman did bring a case to court, the questions she faced could be deeply humiliating. If the attacker was of higher social standing, the woman's chances of justice were even lower. The treatment of sexual violence reflected a deeper truth. The law often saw such acts less as crimes against the woman herself and more as crimes against her male guardian, her father, husband, or master. The injury was framed in terms of damage to the man's property or honor. This view reduced the woman to an object whose value lay in her purity and her connection to a man, rather than in her own rights as a person. Even in cases of public violence, women were often overlooked. Riots, feuds between families, and political unrest could spill into the streets, injuring bystanders and destroying homes. Women caught in such violence were rarely seen as active participants, but they were still victims. And when it came to rebuilding or receiving compensation for losses, their claims carried less weight than those of men. In some cases, women themselves were the targets of public punishment or humiliation. Accusations of witchcraft, adultery, or moral misconduct could lead to harsh penalties. Women might be paraded through the streets, locked in stocks, or subjected to other forms of public shaming. These punishments were designed not just to penalize, but to warn other women about the consequences of stepping outside accepted roles. Public humiliation reinforced the message that a woman's value depended on her obedience to social and moral rules. The vulnerability of women was also tied to their economic dependence. A woman without a male protector, whether a father, husband, brother, or employer, was seen as exposed, at risk, and in need of control. Widows, for example, were often pressured to remarry quickly so that a man could look after them. Unmarried women who tried to live independently could be seen with suspicion, as if their lack of male supervision was a sign of moral weakness. Religious teaching added another layer to this vulnerability. Women were often told that suffering patiently was a virtue. Enduring hardship, whether from poverty, illness, or mistreatment, could be framed as a sign of spiritual strength. While this teaching might have offered comfort, it also discouraged women from seeking justice or demanding better treatment. Accepting one's lot was considered pious. Resisting it could be seen as rebellious or sinful. In wealthier circles, noble women were not immune to violence. While they lived in more comfortable surroundings, they were still subject to forced marriages, political kidnappings, and the dangers of childbirth. Their position might protect them from certain forms of street violence, but it also made them pawns in the political games of powerful men. A noble woman could find herself married off to secure an alliance, held hostage to pressure her family, or even targeted in feuds between rival lords. For poorer women, the risks were constant and close. Domestic service, field labor, or work in markets brought them into contact with many people, some of whom would take advantage of their vulnerable position. A maid dismissed without a reference could find it nearly impossible to secure another position. A washerwoman accused of theft could be barred from the marketplace. These accusations could be made casually, with little need for proof, because a woman's word often carried less weight than a man's. The vulnerability of women in medieval society was not simply the result of individual cruelty. It was built into the very structure of that society. The laws, customs, and beliefs of the time all combined to keep women in a position where they were easier to control, easier to overlook, and easier to blame. This constant exposure to danger, without strong protection from the law or community, sent a clear message. Women were not valued as fully autonomous members of society. And so, the cycle continued. The lack of value placed on women meant fewer protections. Fewer protections meant greater vulnerability. Greater vulnerability reinforced the idea that women needed to be controlled. which in turn justified limiting their freedoms even further. In the Middle Ages, safety and value were intertwined, and for women, both were in short supply. One of the clearest ways to see how medieval society valued women is to look at whose voices were heard and whose were not. In the Middle Ages, the voices that shaped public life, politics, and history were overwhelmingly male. Men made the laws, led the armies, preached the sermons, ran the guilds, and wrote the chronicles. Women's voices, when they were heard at all, were exceptions to the rule. And for most women, the absence of representation meant the absence of recognition, a silence that made them easier to undervalue and overlook. In the governance of medieval towns and kingdoms, women were almost entirely excluded. Town councils, royal courts, and parliaments were made up of men. These were the places where decisions were made about taxes, trade, justice, and war. These decisions affected women's lives as much as men's, but women were rarely present to speak for themselves. When women's concerns were addressed, it was usually because a husband, father, or another male relative spoke on their behalf. The same was true in the legal system. Lawyers, judges, and other officials were men. If a woman had a legal dispute, she usually needed a male representative to present her case. In many courts, a woman could not even stand before the judge without such a representative. This meant that her side of the story was filtered through someone else's voice, someone who might or might not share her perspective. Guilds, which regulated trades and crafts in towns and cities, were also dominated by men. These organizations controlled who could work in a given profession, how goods were produced, and what prices were charged. They also provided social and political influence. While a few guilds allowed women, most excluded them from leadership roles. Even in trades where women were active, such as brewing or textile work, men tended to speak for the trade as a whole. This limited women's ability to influence decisions that affected their livelihoods. The church, which was one of the most powerful voices in medieval life, also kept women out of its highest ranks. Priests, bishops, and popes were all men. The sermons preached to congregations came from male voices. The official interpretation of scripture came from male scholars. While women could enter convents and even lead them as abbesses, they had no place in the formal hierarchy of the church. Their influence, while sometimes real within their own communities, did not extend into the broader decision-making of religious life. In literature and historical writing, women's voices were also scarce. The chronicles that recorded the events of the age were written by men, monks, clerks, and court historians. These writers chose what to record and what to omit. As a result, the experiences of women were often left out, except when they touched on the lives of men. A noblewoman might be mentioned in a marriage alliance, a queen in a coronation, or a widow in a property dispute. But the daily lives, thoughts, and struggles of most women were simply not written down. This lack of written record created a kind of invisibility. Future generations looking back on the Middle Ages would find fewer traces of women's experiences, reinforcing the idea that they were less central to the story of the time. The silence in the record could be mistaken for silence in life, as if women had nothing to say, when in reality, they simply had fewer opportunities to say it in ways that would be preserved. Even in art, where women were often depicted, their voices were absent. Paintings, tapestries, and sculptures showed women as symbols of virtue, beauty, or temptation, but rarely as thinkers, leaders, or creators in their own right. Their images were shaped by the perspectives of male artists and patrons. The stories told through these works reflected male ideals about women's roles, reinforcing the same patterns of undervaluation found in law, religion, and literature. There were, of course, remarkable exceptions. Women who managed to make their voices heard despite the barriers. Some were noble women who acted as regents, ruling on behalf of underage heirs. Others were writers, like Christine de Pizan, who openly challenged negative stereotypes about women. Mystics, like Hildegard of Bingen, wrote theological works and corresponded with popes and emperors. But these women were rare, and their influence, while significant, did not fundamentally change the fact that most women were voiceless in public life. For the vast majority, the absence of representation had real consequences. Without a voice in governance, women had little power to influence laws that affected their rights and freedoms. Without a voice in trade organizations, they had limited say in how their work was valued. Without a voice in the church, they had little ability to shape religious teachings that defined their moral worth. And without a voice in the historical record, they risked being forgotten altogether. This lack of voice fed into a cycle. Because women were not present in the places where important decisions were made, their needs and perspectives were often overlooked. Because they were overlooked, their importance was underestimated. And because their importance was underestimated, there was little effort to bring them into positions of representation. The cycle reinforced itself, keeping women on the margins of public life, generation after generation. In the medieval world, value was tied to visibility. Those who spoke in councils, who signed laws, who led armies, and who were remembered in chronicles were the ones considered important. By keeping women out of these roles, society signaled that they were less important, less capable, and less worthy of influence. Their contributions in the home, in the marketplace, and in the community were essential, but because they were largely invisible in the public sphere. They were undervalued. The truth is that medieval women did have voices. They spoke to one another, to their families, to their communities. They shared stories, passed down knowledge, and advised those around them. But these voices rarely reached the places where history was made and recorded. In that sense, the undervaluation of women was not just about what they could do, but about who was willing to listen and whose words were preserved for the future. As we reach the end of this long and quiet journey through the lives of medieval women, we can begin to see the full shape of the world in which they lived. It was a world where value was measured in ways that placed them at a disadvantage from the moment of their birth. Through their childhood, into marriage, work, and the rest of their lives, we have seen how the story began in childhood, where a girl's worth was often tied not to her own dreams, but to the role others imagined for her. We saw how she was taught the skills that would serve a household, but rarely those that would bring her independence. From her earliest years, she was reminded to be modest, obedient, virtues praised for women, yet ones that often kept them quiet and contained. We walked with her into marriage, where she became not just a wife, but part of a household defined by her husband's name, his work, and his authority. We saw how her ability to bear children was considered one of her greatest contributions, and how the rhythm of her life often became the rhythm of childbearing, child-rearing, and endless work within the home. We followed her into the fields and marketplaces, into the workshops and kitchens, where her labor kept families alive and communities running. Yet we saw, too, how that work was often labeled as helping, as if it were somehow less than the work of men, even when it was equally hard, equally skilled, and equally necessary. We looked at education, and we saw how most girls were denied the tools of learning that might have given them a stronger voice in their world. Without access to schools, to books, or to the higher places of study, their knowledge was shaped almost entirely by tradition, family, and the tasks of survival. Those who did manage to gain an education were rare exceptions, women who had to find unusual paths just to learn what their brothers were freely given. We examined the law, and we saw how it treated women as dependents, tying their rights and property to the men in their lives. The law assumed that a woman needed someone to speak for her, to decide for her, to guard her interests. Even widows, who sometimes managed their own affairs, were encouraged to remarry so that a man could take up that role again. We looked at religion, and we saw how the church both honored and limited women. It praised their moral worth, their purity, their devotion, but it also reinforced the idea that they were subordinate to men, spiritually equal in theory, but socially bound by divine order. The examples it held up for women to follow were often those of obedience, humility, and service. We spoke of danger, and we saw how vulnerable women were to violence, both within their homes and in the wider world. The protections available to them were often weak, and justice, when sought, could be slow or unsympathetic. Many endured in silence because the risks of speaking out or trying to leave could be greater than the safety they hoped to gain. We explored representation, and we saw how women's voices were absent from the places where history was made. They were rarely in the councils where decisions were taken, rarely in the courts where laws were shaped, rarely in the guilds that controlled work and trade. Their words were not often written down, and so their stories were less likely to be remembered. Without a voice in public life, their concerns could be ignored, their contributions overlooked, and their worth underestimated. All of these threads weave together into a picture that explains why medieval women were considered less valuable in their society. It was not because they lacked intelligence or skill or strength. It was because the structures of their world, its laws, its customs, its beliefs were designed to place them in roles of dependence and service. And when you live in a role that is defined by service, it is easy for others to forget that your value is equal to theirs. But even in this quiet and limited space, medieval women lived full and complex lives. They worked, they cared, they taught, they created. They shaped the world in ways that were not always recorded, but which were deeply felt in the lives of those around them. They raised the next generation, tended the sick, kept households together in times of scarcity, and maintained the rhythms of daily life in villages and towns. And some women found ways to push beyond the boundaries set for them. They became landowners, businesswomen, writers, mystics, healers, and leaders within their own communities. These women remind us that even in a world that undervalued them, women were not powerless. They used the space they had, and sometimes they found ways to make that space larger. Still, the larger truth remains. In the eyes of medieval society, women were valued less. That undervaluation was not an accident. It was the result of centuries of law, belief, and tradition working together. And because it was so deeply woven into the fabric of medieval life, it could not be easily undone. When we look back at this world today, we can see how far things have changed, but also how many echoes remain. The story of medieval women is not just a story of the past. It is a reminder of how important it is to hear every voice, to recognize every contribution, and to measure value not by tradition or stereotype. So, as we leave this journey, we carry with us the understanding that the undervaluation of women in the Middle Ages was not about their true worth, but about how society chose to see them. And perhaps, in remembering this, we can better see and better value the voices, the work, and the lives of women in every age.